Hey folks, and welcome to Sunken Media, where we'll be discovering and discussing lost, forgotten, or underappreciated media. This is the first in our obscure queer horror series, where we'll be talking about spooky little gems that have LGBTQ characters or themes. Could be movies, TV, comics, we'll discuss it all. And our first one takes us to the sun-soaked Mexican coast for a little death. Grab your cover-up and your waterproof mascara, kids. We're taking it to the beach. A tale of murder, questionable butt stuff, topless swimming in full makeup, like a lot of makeup, heterosexual middle-aged making out, awkward homoeroticism, fabulous dinner parties, more straight middle-aged making out, plenty, and I mean plenty of hot Speedo action, and of course, death. Today's obscure queer horror is the soapy Spanish language slasher, Death on the Beach. Hey, welcome to Sunken Media, and this is our little viewing grotto where we'll be discussing the sunken treasures we uncover. I just discovered this one myself about a month ago. If you want to check it out before we get into all the spoilers, it is available on Shudder. It is a fun one, even if it is a little problematic. Let's just dive right in. So we open on an apparently naked man wandering through a mansion and discovering our first bit of gratuitous nudity. And there is going to be plenty of gratuitous nudity in this one, but most of it is men this time around. Kind of refreshing. Our little stalker finds this sleeping beauty, gives him a bonk, and a rather unpleasant hurt. And then we cut to the Mexican coast, where we meet our leading lady, and she is fabulous. How fabulous is she? Well, she's bobbing around topless in her backyard pool next to her mansion in full makeup, and she's just soaking up those credits and putting pool debris in her mouth. Ew. When we have the arrival of her lover, and he's been away for a long time, so he gives her that look, takes the pool debris out of her mouth, and you know what time it is.
Taste the biscuit. Taste the goodness of the biscuit.
So we get a few minutes of that. It was the 90s, the age of Basic Instinct. You had to have naked women writhing on things for it to really be a thriller. I promise this is a gay movie. Even though this is one of the posters, stick with me. We finally get to discussing the son coming home. She says he's going to stop studying to come back for a while, and the lover wonders if the son's going to accept him.
Si me amas de verdad, por supuesto.
And then we're introduced to the hunky gardener, who is almost always half naked, sometimes completely naked, and never has shoes on. And the son finally arrives. His name is David, and we're introduced to this cute little brat twink. And I thought this actor who played the main character, Andre Bonfiglio, and I'm sorry if I massacred that name, he was really good. I thought he did a nice job of playing kind of the bratty little rich boy. Then we immediately learned that the gardener is mute, or perhaps deaf, and maybe, has some other issues. But we realized through their dialogue, the gardener has obviously been working for the family for a long time, and the boy has known the gardener for a while. He then goes in to find mom and the lover. I'll stop calling him that. We learn in this scene that his name is Paul. And David and Paul are finally introduced for the first time. A little while later, they're kind of around the pool. David's splashing around. Paul and mom are discussing him where he can very obviously hear them, and he calls them out on that. And this is the first time that Paul kind of suggests a pretty young lady for David. It's also the first time that David has said he's not interested. He wants to make his own friends. His mom also brings up that she is horrified about this crime that happened at his school, that it was such a nice school. These people come from money. She can't believe that something like that would happen there. He basically says he was terrified, that all the students are terrified, and that he does not want to go back to school. He's going to stay around at home and help mom with the business. They don't really at this point get into what the crime is. Obviously, it's the murder from earlier in the movie. Ow. And she kind of leaves it at, whatever you want to do with school or stay here to help me with the business, that's up to you, but I think you should decide for yourself so that Paul and I can have time to enjoy each other. So then we cut to mom's business. We're never actually told what the business is. We know she's in business mode because she's got on her readers while she's sitting in her peacock chair, talking seriously on the phone about contracts. But check out this office. Clearly somebody's dining room, isn't it? So then they basically discuss that Paul and the mother are getting married, and David's not very happy about that, but the mom says you better just get used to it, and then says, okay, let's not argue, and just moves on. So she moves on to a subject that's going to make him even madder. She wants to get a secretary for him, and she's brought a couple for him to choose from, and she's got some other motives here, most likely. And this is the second time now that he makes it very clear that he's not interested in being set up with girls, and he's not interested in having these secretaries. And he kind of cowers like a scared little boy behind her peacock chair while the girls make flirty faces at him. And she finally kind of says, yeah, well, I'm the boss. So...
tienes que enseñarte a obedecer.
And then we cut to one of Mother's fabulous dinner parties. And it's one of those dinner parties in movies where they just have music playing over the whole thing and people just mime things. And you're just supposed to know, I guess, that they're having a good time because they're like laughing with each other and pointing at things or whatever. But as we watch them wine and dine and laugh, it becomes clear that some of it was kind of a setup for David and this girl who's here. And honestly, they never explain who this girl was. And I went back just to make sure that it wasn't one of those secretaries. It's not. I have no idea who this girl was or where she came from. There was an allusion earlier that Paul had a daughter. Maybe that's her, but I don't know. Anyway, they're trying to set David up with this random girl. They're standing outside the party and the girl tells David he's weird, which is probably not the best way to pick somebody up. And then they notice some hippies down on the beach.
A mí me encantan los vagos. ¿Vamos a verlos?
So she loves hippies. So they go on down there and the hippies are doing this, which is apparently appealing to this random girl. So she joins the fun. And all of the hippies are drinking out of giant green coconuts, which I only mention because it comes up later, kind of. David says he doesn't drink. He's not interested in any of this. He doesn't even like this girl. So like after being there for all of 15 seconds, David decides to leave. And the next day, David's in a pool and this random girl is there. And that is... I watched this a couple times too, and I'm not even sure whose pool this is because it's not the pool that the mom was in earlier, if I'm not mistaken. You know what? I don't know. Maybe it was. This must be Paul's daughter. But you get this sense that David is rather conflicted about her being there. And then for some reason, we cut to them on the beach, and the girl is trying very hard to make things happen. And David makes it pretty clear that he is not interested.
¿Qué pasa? ¿Qué tienes en la sangre, agua?
And immediately cut to the gardener drinking half naked in his bed. Now this is the first scene of like a lot of scenes where there's this weird, awkward homoeroticism and it's kind of gay. I mean, it's really gay, but it's also kind of not. I can't quite put my finger on if this was made by a queer director or it's kind of like a straight man's interpretation of what gay people are like. I mean, parts of it are kind of hot, but weird. So then after that little scene, we cut to a close-up. I don't know why. I mean, it's fine. I'm not complaining. But she's still at it. Random girl. She's still trying. And David is yet again saying no. So he basically calls her a not very nice name.
Eres una puta. No eres un hombre. Eres homosexual.
And that's the end of that. And then he's sitting there looking forlorn. And this guy shows up.
David.
And this is why I brought up the coconuts before. He's one of the hippies, I guess. And the only way you really know that is because of the green coconuts. It was not until the third time that I watched the movie, I was like, who is this guy who shows up on his patio with coconut drinks? So this is like the second scene of many of awkward, like it was shot by somebody who didn't know how gay people flirt. Maybe the director told him it wasn't supposed to be too gay. Maybe the actors weren't actually gay. I don't know. They tried their best, but it was equal parts awkward and sexy. Mostly awkward. So they're flirting, I guess. They pet each other and stare at each other for a long time.
That's nice.
But the hippie says he wants to be Daniel's friend, and he says that they're the same. It's kind of cute. So the next day, Mom comes out and asks David why the random girl left and seemed to be so mad at the time, and David pulls out this little gem.
Guárdate tu veneno, mamá. Yo soy inmune a él.
And saunters off in his Speedo. And then we cut to a nice pool party with all the guys. So we got the gardener, the two hippies, and then Mom and Paul are still splashing around on the other side of the pool. And Paul raises concerns that the hookup with the random girl didn't quite work out. And he says David's a little too interested in those Speedo gentlemen. And David's mom says he just needs friends and he's very independent. But Paul says he's got some strange interests.
No te atrevas a dudar de la integridad sexual de David.
Later on, David and his mother are playing cards in perfectly appropriate card-playing attire, and Mom proposes that maybe David go to the club with Paul sometime. He suspects she's got ulterior motives, and she asks about those Speedo gentlemen and says, "Are you guys
Solo amigos?
And so to make her happy and to stop this conversation, David agrees to go to the club with Paul. And then we see David hanging out with his new hippie friends at the beach. And these new hippie friends say that they plan on moving along that night. They've gotten bored of this beach already.
O sea que ya no habrá más de eso.
And David said, "So yeah, I had a great time, but yeah, you guys have fun." And then the guys say, "Well, it's time for you to pay up for your bribes." And this was a little bit confusing. I don't really know exactly what that means, but they're basically trying to shake David down for money. They try to take his watch, they try to rough him up a little bit, and then they say you gotta accept your sexuality, and he ends up pushing them both off a cliff. This, of course, is the death on the beach of the title. So then we get lots of shots of David in a Speedo, pondering what he's done. So then he goes back home and runs to the gardener's room and gets a sponge bath and confesses. But because the gardener is mute and deaf, it's not really confessing. So Mom and Paul are at it in the pool again. And Paul brings up that he's worried about that accident with those two guys. The mom says, "Hey, David's suffering. He lost his friends. Let's just think about David." And David shows up, and that ends that conversation. He's also still concerned about David spending time with girls.
Unas muchachas.
So the next day, David's sitting at the beach really close to a towel that's not his. It's apparently not his, because the person who owns that towel then comes up, sits on it, and strikes up a conversation. They never mention why he's sitting so weirdly close to the towel. Anyway, this is where he meets his new friends, and this movie does this a lot. They just kind of chuck people at you out of nowhere and get rid of people out of nowhere. So this is a couple he meets, Nuria and Tony. And Tony's probably the more important one to remember here. And when David points out his mansion up on the hill, Tony is immediately impressed. You can tell there's a little intrigue there between those two. So they make plans to go surfing later together, and David takes off while Tony gives him a good look up and down.
Yes, Daddy.
So then we get this short scene where David goes home to find his mom having a glass of wine, and she asks him about this bruise on his face, which he's had in several scenes already. I don't know why she brings it up at this point, but he just says, "I fell on the beach," and that he's going to go out for the night. And she's uneasy about this. And then the next day you see that Paul and David went to this club, are getting massaged by these attractive young ladies, I guess. And David kind of lays out his suspicions that Paul is only with his mom for her money. And Paul kind of sets him straight and says, "I'm not in it for the money." And
Sé un poco más discreto con tus inclinaciones sexuales.
And David says no matter what, his mom's going to side with him. He's her baby. To which Paul says, "I can have the police investigate exactly what happened on that beach, so let's just be friends." In another instance of the movie throwing another random character at you, David finds this woman, and she kind of alludes to the fact that the mother hired her to be a secretary, but that he wasn't into all the other secretaries. And he basically says, like, "Why are you doing this? Are you trying to get a better position in my mom's company?" And she says, "No."
Me pagaron muy bien para hacer el amor contigo.
To which, of course, he's upset and goes over to an open window. She basically says, "Your mom and Paul just want to make sure you aren't gay, so are you gay?" And he throws her out the window.
¿Lo eres?
And this funny, evil little grin from David. And the next morning, David is obviously worrying about this new death on his hands. David just tries defending himself, and, "Oh, she fell out the window, yada yada." And his mom says, "Don't worry, my lawyers have taken care of it. It's going to be okay. Take it easy."
Tendrás que agradecerle a Paul que haya declarado en tu favor.
David finds Paul preparing himself a drink at the bar and just kind of thanks him for helping to smooth over everything.
Lo Lo hice para evitarle a tu madre un problema de graves consecuencias.
And then he kind of comedically suggests that maybe the boy could try San Francisco. And of course, David's like, whoa, why San Francisco?
Ahí los jóvenes como tú pueden dar rienda suelta a sus desviaciones.
And David basically says, what's your game? And Paul says, I just want to keep you away from your mother. I don't like you. I think you're weird. And I don't want you in our life. And again, David accuses Paul of just being after the money. To which Paul says, I have a lot more than either of you. I'm not here for the money.
Pero ya estoy cansado de que tu madre sea una estúpida. Que no abra los ojos y se dé cuenta que tiene un hijo homosexual.
Which throws David into a fury. And he ends up threatening Paul.
¡Date por muerto!
Cut to David and the gardener and the new beach friends now out enjoying the water. And his new friends basically start asking about the gardener, and David kind of explains that he's been with the family for a long time and he's totally loyal. And to prove this, David jumps off the boat and pretends to drown, and the gardener, of course, immediately jumps in after him and saves his life, which I guess is supposed to impress his friends. And then Nuria goes ahead and takes a dip in the water, leaving the gentleman alone for a little bit. So Tony scooches on over to David and says, yeah, you invited me over to your house, buddy. And David says, yeah, you're gonna come alone? And he says, sure. And so we kind of know what's going on with those two. Sometime later, I guess, Tony has now come over to David's house, and he is poolside with Paul, David, and his mom. She's got her bathing suit on this time. And David's mom asks Tony about his girlfriend, and Tony says he's actually going to be getting married. And she says, oh, that's too bad, David, another friend you're gonna lose. And Tony adamantly says,
Bueno, la amistad puede continuar, aun cuando las esposas no dejen que sus maridos sigan viendo a sus amigos.
Tony just shoots a knowing look. And then Tony says, hey, David, why don't you show me that bedroom of yours?
Claro, vamos.
So they're hanging out half naked in his room, looking at his fine art, talking about how basically David and Paul have a bad relationship, but Tony says, I'm having a great time, I'm just happy to be with you. A little bit more awkward flirting. David asks about Nubia, and Tony says,
Nubia puede esperar.
all right then. So the next day, the two young gentlemen meet up with Nubia, the girlfriend, where they are dancing and frolicking on the beach. Oh, yes, they are. Little throuple. So later that night, Tony comes over for dinner, and they're talking with the mom and Paul, and they're both actually going to be going out of town on business. And they were wondering if maybe Tony might like to just stick around and keep David a little company. It's kind of odd, like if they're worried about him being gay, or they're actually hiring prostitutes to prove he's not gay. Why are they then encouraging this? But yeah, he's on board. Tony is totally down to come hang out with David. So now, home alone together, stuff really starts to kind of come together. And I thought this scene was really kind of interesting. However, it is also probably the most problematic scene in the whole movie. So they're sitting around chit-chatting, and David's basically asking, like, why did you come stay with me? And there's a very flirty, sexy undertone to the whole thing.
Pensé que te gustaría algo más.
They dance around it a little bit, and Tony finally says,
¿Eres homosexual?
Sí, soy homosexual.
it was interesting. That line really hit. It was surprising just to see something from that era, the main character of the story, to say, I am a homosexual. It felt like something I hadn't seen in an American movie, and certainly not in the horror genre of the early 90s, late 80s. And there's kind of, a nice moment afterwards where David says, well, why don't you get up and leave? Why don't you run away from me? Why don't you want to stay away? And Tony says, why? This doesn't change anything. And, it was kind of nice, and it felt, sort of revolutionary for the time. It was not something that I can remember seeing in movies when I was younger like that. And then they kind of start flirting again, and he says, but I've got a girlfriend. And David says, I know, I don't care. And Tony says, yeah, I know, I don't either. There's a nice, sweet, and unexpected moment, but then it's kind of like immediately undercut by...
David, ¿por qué eres así?
Un maestro en la escuela me violó. Me gustó.
Which just kind of feels like this outdated idea of like homosexuality was a disorder that was caused by A, B, or C. It kind of goes to some dark, weird places. David basically explains that he believes gay people have a great sensitivity and a great ability to give, and he'd like Tony to know this. And Tony says, why are you telling me all this? And David says,
Porque me gustas, Tony. Quiero que seamos algo más que amigos.
And Tony says, well, okay, I could be into that.
Y mucho.
So cut to Tony in the bathtub with his girlfriend, and she is clearly kind of upset and jealous by the whole thing. She doesn't like Tony hanging out with him. She thinks David's kind of weird, and she's not really interested in her fiance hanging out with this guy. Tony accuses her of being jealous. She says she's not. She just doesn't want him going. Tony says he likes staying with David, and he's going to stay with David. So then we get some more Speedo action. We get a montage of kind of the boys' weekend. They horseplay in the pool. They go parasailing. They have beers by the beach. It's kind of cute. I mean, one's a psychopath and the other one's a cheater, but it's still kind of cute. Paul comes back into town and he's hanging out by the pool, sees Tony splashing around, kind of calls him over. Paul is asking Tony all about his girlfriend, his upcoming wedding, says how expensive that can be, basically leading up to Paul suggesting to Tony that he'll give him $10,000 if Tony can just get David into a compromising position so that Paul can catch it on videotape. He'll then show that videotape to David's mom to prove that David is gay once and for all. Now, to the modern mind, one wonders, why does this guy care so much about David's sexuality? Within the framework of the story, he kind of says, I'm concerned about all these deaths that are happening around this kid, and if I could prove his sexuality once and for all, I don't know, it would prove that he was a murderer. I'm not entirely sure. It's a little convoluted. Didn't really work for me, but Tony seems to agree with it. More importantly, David catches the two of them talking and it sends him into this tailspin where he has these nightmares and this flashback of when he was attacked at his school by his teacher. The next day we see him standing by the ocean and the gardener comes up behind him. Then David confesses he was in fact the one who killed the teacher.
Y por atrás con una varilla donde más le gustaba.
And says thank God the gardener's deaf. He'll never know what he just said. And then we see David and Tony in bed together, enjoying each other's company, pretty much getting busy. It's probably the gayest part of the movie. And even though clearly, maybe because of the time, the actors were not allowed to kiss or anything, there's some nice chemistry between the two. And you kind of think, I don't know, maybe this could work out. Maybe something could happen here with these two. We're not totally sure at this point whether Tony is into it for the money or for the love, but it's kind of cute, even though one of them is a murderer and the other one is doing something really skeezy. And then, of course, Paul arrives, and indeed, Tony was in on the whole thing. There's been a video camera capturing it the whole time, and Tony tries to calm down David, but obviously David is infuriated. He runs after Paul, trying to get the tape. Paul basically outlines that it is pure and simple blackmail. He's going to keep that tape and that this will be an agreement between the two of them. He says David will stay out of their lives, get lost, live his life by himself, and leave Paul and Mom alone. And Paul will just keep his mouth shut about all the weird deaths and the fact that David is gay.
Te voy a matar.
No, David. Ya no vas a matar a nadie.
Tony comes out and tries to comfort David, and David accuses him of being a part of it, and he admits that.
Lo hice por una lana, hombre.
And we see the gardener drinking alone in his room again. He seems to drink a lot. I don't know if the insinuation is that maybe he's not actually deaf and he's been carrying all these family secrets, or all of this really weighs on him, or maybe he's just an alcoholic. But sometimes it just seems like it's an excuse to see a sweaty, half-naked man drinking. Speaking of gratuitous nudity, we get Tony splayed out in the bed. Then he wakes up and decides to do the obligatory horror movie shower scene, where of course there's plenty of footage of Tony soaping up. And of course, David is there to get his revenge. He tells Tony he really liked him, and part of you kind of feels bad for David, even though he's killing Tony.
Quería en serio.
So David stabs Tony to death in the shower and then goes into the gardener's room, and the gardener is passed out drunk in there. So David puts the knife in the gardener's hand, smears him with Tony's blood, basically tries to frame him. So the poor loyal gardener then, of course, gets arrested and is held in a cell, for some reason completely naked. It's mostly just an excuse to have this poor actor flop around. So he basically strangles the guard and breaks out of prison. Meanwhile, David's back home ransacking the house, trying to find this videotape of him and Tony canoodling. And then Mom and Paul arrive home. She basically denies that her son had any wrongdoing of any kind. Paul basically says you can't keep denying this, and gives her the videotape, as if her son having gay sex is going to prove something. So Mom basically catches him ransacking the house and says, "Are you looking for this?" And he says, Paul had no right to do that. This is my life. That's none of his business. And she accuses him him of everything. She says, you killed your friends, you killed the girl we paid to have sex with you killed Tony, and he comes back with the perfect rich brat response. You never paid any attention to me, you never had time for me, you were too busy with your own stuff, and so I had to kill people, I guess. And then, of course, the gardener shows up, still half naked, and he's got the knife from before somehow, and he ends up chasing little David out to the pool, and of course, David gets his comeuppance. And just as the gardener has finished killing David, Paul shows up with his gun. Why was he armed? And shoots the gardener dead. And we end with this tragic tableau. In weird video quality, a tragic ending for a tragic character. So that was it. That was our first obscure queer horror. I was excited when I found this one. I consider myself a big film fanatic, and I tend to stay up on a lot of LGBTQ films, and so I'm always surprised when I find one I haven't seen. One that's, over 30 years old now, and a horror. I just wanted to share this one with you guys. I don't think anyone's going to put this on their favorite film list. Definitely not a masterpiece, more of a B movie, but it was sexy, it was fun, there was an attractive cast, and again, the nudity was mostly male, so that was kind of refreshing. If it seemed like it was fun, go check it out on Shudder. And that pretty much does it, guys. That was Death on the Beach. If you have any other suggestions for other queer horrors they're just not talking about enough on YouTube, drop them in the comments below. Let's help people find these little hidden gems. Well, that is it for today from the Viewing Grotto. Thanks for joining me. We'll catch you on the next edition of Sunken Media.